complexity, no one has the final word. The price that you pay for this is, of course, that there is a sheer unstoppable inundation of misinformation, disinformation, and so on. But the problem here is that nobody can claim to have the right information anymore. We desperately need to develop skills of skepticism because nobody has, let's say, a privileged access to truth. Complexity is basically about the weaving or the interweaving of stories or narratives. It's always good to get as much stories as you can.
The world order is fragmenting, our knowledge of it too. Policymakers need to deal with this complexity, including in relation to China. Dutch philosopher René ten Bos explains to Joris Piereboom that we need to work on our skills of skepticism.
You've written about a lot of subjects: climate change, bureaucracy, populism, and you could say maybe that the unifying theme in all of that is complexity. We want to dive in some questions about complexity. What is complexity? What can we learn from it? But also, what are the consequences for governments navigating in an increasingly complex world?
It's not so much that you weave complexity, but complexity is about the weaving, or rather the interweaving of narratives, stories, and so on. So philosophers nearly always have the inclination to look at the etymology of words. So the word complexity stems from com, which means together, and plectere, which is the Latin word for weaving, braiding, entwining, these kind of words. So what you basically see in terms of complexity is that you weave together several stories, several narratives, and so on. To provide you with an example of complexity, which was the recent pandemics, the first story is this is all about a zoonosis, which is to say that the virus came from an animal and jumped, as it were, over to a human species. But then another story creeps in, and which tells us that it's not so much about a zoonosis, but rather an accident in a laboratory. And then you get, again, other stories. And this interweaving of narratives that almost happens instantaneously and also happenstance. And this interweaving of narratives, what I mean by happenstance is nobody controls this, is I think highly characteristic of complexity. So plectere means entwined, entangled, weaving, interweaving, and so forth. So that's basically what complexity is all about. That is to say that you cannot describe complexity in the normal analytical words that you have. Complexity is not about analysis. It's not about unfolding things. It's not about default. In words like develop and complicated and so on. And these are entirely different words, because there's always this idea that you can unfold and refold things, and the more you unfold things, and the more you start to see. Basically, it means that you never get never a total grip on what complexity is. Complexity is a word that constantly pops up in contemporary discourses. So the political situation is complex, the ecological problems that we have is complex, the loss of biodiversity is complex, and so on. And all these problems basically mean that at the end of the story you get this amalgam and this proliferation of stories that somehow are connected and also not connected. There are a lot of ruptures and so on. But the point is that nobody gets to the final word. And nobody has a particular claim to truth here in terms of complexity. And that's very interesting, because it casts a certain shadow on, let's say, political claims as far as authority is concerned, or on expertise claims. And that is to say, the scientist who claims to know it all. In terms of complexity, what complexity basically means, there is nobody who knows it all. That is to say, it's asked certain questions about the authority of expertise, or the authority of knowledge, and so on. Because there is always looming the possibility of another story, another perspective, another narrative, and so on.
You tell us, compel us to think differently. In what way does complexity demand something different from us?
When a thing is complicated, it means that it is composed of parts. That also entails that you can decompose it into parts. And then it is always possible, if you have the knowledge, if you know about the technology and so on, it is always possible to explain what the function of each single part is with respect to the entire gadget, phone, piece of technology, whatever. And that's the interesting thing. And that is, classically, this means that, and this is how we have been thinking for a long time, you can analyze problems. How do you analyze problems? Basically to decompose the problem into smaller parts. And then you reconstruct it or recompose it when you get the whole again. Now, this is a way of thinking that is clearly impossible when it comes to complexity. This is what I mean when I say that complex problems are not analyzable. And that is to say, you do not know what the parts do in order to compose the whole complex system. That's the problem. You do not know what the role is, what the function is, and so on. That is one of the big problems with complexity. So classical problem analysis, as managers, for example, have been taught for many, many decades. Let's say since scientific management by Frederick Taylor and so on. And this clearly doesn't work when we talk about complexity, since you cannot decompose or out-analyze complexity. That's the big difference. What I'm very much interested in, that is the problem of transparency. And complexity is always opaque rather than transparent. And when you have complicated systems, you can make them transparent. And if you start to think about complexity, then you will you have to accept that there is a certain kind of opaqueness that cannot be eliminated from your thought. So transparency is basically what is a hallmark of complexity as well. The words that we use for that in the literature and so on are indeed opaque, but also trouble, fuzzy, and so on. So if we talk about philosophy, what constitutes real knowledge, you can read it with René Descartes already, at the brink of modernity. He taught us always that decent knowledge should consist of clear and distinct ideas. There's id, clear, et distinct. And complexity belies this. Complexity is never about clear and distinct ideas. If we talk about global warming, which is one way to look at it, it doesn't mean that it will get warmer here in this area, the Low Countries, so to speak. There is a likelihood actually that it might get colder here, whereas in other places in the world it will get warmer. Likelihoods. So there's another term which is important when we talk about complexity. There are no certainties anymore. We talk about and we negotiate probabilities. So that means it's always very interesting when I talk, for example, to people who work in politics, municipalities, but also the national politics and so on. Politicians always are eager to deal with certainties. But when we talk about complexity, this certainty is not available anymore. Basically, what we just have is the probability that this will happen to you. It's a very normal existential situation. When we talk about different ways of thinking, one way to look at it is that you talk about curative thinking and preventive thinking. And curative thinking is always, okay, we have a problem, we analyze the problem, we look somewhere in the analysis, we encounter the root problem, of the root cause of the problem. And when we have this root cause, we eliminate this cause, and then we have the problem solved. Politicians always deal in cures. They always have this idea of we can provide you with a panacea or a remedy to solve the problems. One of the key distinctions that I always make is the distinction between curative thinking and preventive thinking. Whereas curative thinking is always very concrete, preventive thinking is highly abstract and is therefore much more difficult to fathom for many people than curative thinking. So suppose you go to a physician and you have a certain problem. If this doctor tells you then, I have this kind of cure for you, you are always happy. You get a pill, you get something like that. However, if this doctor, which is somewhat different, tells you, nah, I'd rather not give you a pill, but I rather tell you that you should think a little bit more about, let's say, your lifestyle. Then you are addressed in a certain way that you might not like. The doctor approaches you in a way that's not neutral. Probably he even criticizes your lifestyle. It touches you more, and at the same time it is more abstract, because you never know what might be the consequences of, let's say, certain preventive measures. So this was on a micro level, which is your concrete contact with a doctor, but you can also put it on a macro level. So the recent pandemic was very interesting, so in this respect, because when the vaccines were introduced, they were presented by politicians in this country, but also in other countries, as a cure to the problem. If only we use the vaccines, then sooner or later all our problems will be resolved. And eventually the pandemic will disappear. The virus will die out, and you know all these promises that we got. Then you see the complexity again. Different stories are entwined with the first story. And then you see that there are certain shortcomings in terms of curative thinking. Yeah? And then people start to think about what would it mean when we take an approach that emphasizes prevention. And in the scientists have, but also social commentators and so on, have of course conjured up a term for that, and that's preparedness, which is basically just another word for prevention. What should we do in order to prevent calamities such as a pandemic and so on? There's a completely different narrative from the curative approach. Discussions about environment are basically also highly discussions about lifestyle. Can we do something on the problems? I know there's a huge debate about it. Are the ecological problems that are related to the Anthropocene and so on, are they anthropogenic or not? Or should we do something about it? There's a whole discussion about this. We have facts, but some of these facts can be seen, but this is different. I never spoke to this about that as well. But some of these facts have deontological consequences. That is, there are facts that call for certain duties that we have to perform. So deon, which is the Greek word for duty. It's highly simplified what I'm saying now, okay, there is climate change. Is it a fact? Well, suppose that's a fact. It's a likelihood. And is it a likelihood that brings with it certain deontic effects? That is to say, should we derive from what scientists say certain moral duties? That facts that come that generate obligations that we have to fulfill in order to solve the problem. I hope you see the analogy that I'm making with your own problems. So preparedness or prevention is always, you yourself should do something about your own health. There is a certain kind of deontic effect here, which is very interesting. That's one of the problems with prevention. That's why people don't like prevention. Whereas a cure, you can stick to your lifestyle. You can cling on it as long as you want and so on, because for whatever problem you have, there is this miracle pill, this magic bullet that will save the day. And you don't have to think about who you are. There is another problem with prevention, and that is, and this is typical for philosophers. We like to think in an aporetic way. Aporias are basically what philosophers are interested in. And aporia is a problem that you cannot spoil by easy answers. And so you have no way out. Literally, that's the meaning of an aporia. So kids always ask questions that you cannot answer. Daddy, why is there something rather than nothing? And you feel a certain kind of embarrassment about the problem that is that they ask you about. The embarrassment that you feel with prevention is precisely that there is a kind of expectancy that what you want to prevent might come or not, depending on how you carry out your tasks or how you pick up your duties and how you handle the deontic effect of what is going on, and what will it cost society? What will it cost society to be alert for what might happen, even though you are not entirely certain that it will actually happen? That is the kind of aporia that we are talking about here. And that's difficult. So some of my colleagues political scientists, philosophers and so on are eschewing the idea that you have a society that invests a lot in preparedness or in prevention, simply because the cost will be too high, simply also because it will probably lead to a social, psychological situation in which people are very afraid, constantly alert. We don't want to live a life that is constantly on the alert. Prevention might actually, in the end, be more expensive than cure. So so what you get here is an entanglement of different aporias. Cure versus prevention, what is economically wise, the cure or the prevention, and so on. Or another aporia, which is basically on a professional level. That is, it reminds me a little bit about a conversation that I had last week with some medical professionals, and they simply like to go into a surgery, and they simply like to open up a body and to solve a problem over there, get rid of a tumor or cancer or whatever, and so on. That is basically what their professional outset is. And then all of a sudden they need to talk about prevention. Think of a dentist. We always do this hygienic work in our mouths and so on, which is basically about prevention. That is not why a dentist has chosen this profession. They always dislike that kind of work. They want to help serious problems. So this is basically these are some aporia. Problems in which you have to make a decision about cures and prevention. And generally, people think in terms of prefer, I think, cures.
That makes it also harder to convince people to do otherwise, probably, if everything is interconnected with uncertainties. Things might happen or might not. You maybe need a different kind of story.
Yeah, well, if it's true what I just said, that prevention is more abstract, then it is also more difficult to sell to people. And this is basically what happens. The problem for scientists to come up with a convincing representation of complexity is very difficult. They, as I once wrote, they need good stories, good narratives that will eventually convince people. I can explain, of course, with graphics, with numbers and so on, that we actually witness a loss of biodiversity in the Dutch landscape at the moment. Actually, the loss of biodiversity is worldwide. And you cannot explain with numbers all these hockey stick curves, but they become tedious to many people, boring. And the more you present these hockey stick curves or these alarming numbers, the less alarming they get. That's one of the interesting paradoxes. So what you need is ways to come up with a compelling image or representation of the problems that we are talking about. This is a well-known example. Entomologists can easily point out to you what the problem of biodiversity is when we talk about insects. They come up with numbers and so on. That's one side of the medal. But as soon as a professor, as I once saw, explains to the audience that when you drove your car in, let's say, 30 years ago on the highway somewhere in Holland during a nice summer evening, you always had a bloodbath on your rear window. Yeah, then that's what people understand. This is basically what they get. Then you have a compelling image. It's not always the case that these images are true, but they convince people. This is what times of complexity also mean. Scientists should not always think that truth will convince people. The truth as such is hardly ever convincing. People have all sorts of denials and psychological defense mechanisms not to accept the truth. But as soon as there is a compelling image that pierces through these defense mechanisms, then you have a highly effective way of communicating, which implies that scientists often should be thinking about is it truth that we find, that we unravel and so on, that will eventually convince people. And I'm not sure that it will always do. It's not always effective to tell the truth. And people, this, mind you, this is also related to the problem of transparency. Yeah, because if you open up things, then things become transparent. It's very interesting. What do scientists say? Everybody is now and then cheating on his partner at home. So if I speak to audience and so, I always ask them, or not always, but it happens that I ask them, who has been cheating recently on your partner? And first I ask them, I should explain this, that you always love the truth, you want to base your actions on truth, you always want to tell the truth, there is a kind of moral condemnation of lies and so on. And so on. And the first thing that you ask who is cheating on his partner at home, it's very simple. Nobody admits to it. Nevertheless, the scientists know that 70 or 80% of the people have cheated on their partners at home. These people who at the same time that they say that they cling to the truth, want to be truthful, and so on, are nevertheless hopelessly lying about their own behavior. Yeah, that is to say, truth is not always something that people can digest.
What does this complexity thinking entails for policymakers? Even within the government, a lot of knowledge is fragmented. Different departments are siloed. There is a vast bureaucracy. You wrote a lot about that, about being bureaucracy being a hyper object which no one really can control. So how can thinking in complexity and everything you sketched out so far help us to improve and to collaborate also within the government?
Policy makers, no, first of all, there are the politicians, and I remind you of a word that our former Prime Minister said, Rutte. We have, when he was talking about the pandemic, we have a massive problem for which we want solutions, but we only have 50% certainty. Welcome to the world, I was thinking. So whenever you make a decision, you don't have this complete certainty about what you did. This is precisely the hallmark of what decision making is all about. Every philosopher, Derrida and so on, can explain you that, because otherwise you don't make a decision. You simply are running through a program, which you might do. But a decision always involves a certain of uncertainty. That is to say that decision-making processes on a political level become infested with a certain existential element. That is to say, they have to cope with uncertainty, unpredictability, and all other hallmarks of complexity. And that is to say, they will always hesitate. They will always be in doubt about what is going on. And they will always have to cloak themselves in skills. Seymour Hersh, a famous journalist, once argued that what we should do these days is to develop the skills of skepticism. And the skills of skepticism is that they never can admit to a certainty, to a decent ground on which to stand. And this is, of course, precisely what's the problem. Because if they cannot have this certainty, this will eventually undermine their authority. I remind you, which I always like to do, of Thomas Hobbes, who always explained that the authority of the state is based on the capacity of the state to protect its citizens. Nobody believes the environment at face value, so to speak, and so on. And this is clearly related to the idea that people do not see how the government or how politicians can protect them anymore. And that's from a Hobbesian standpoint. So if we go back to this famous remark, political obligation ends, we are supposed to oblige to the authority or to any dogmatic layer in our society, and in return, we get protection. That's basically the idea. But as soon as this protection cannot be guaranteed, this is basically what complexity is all about. As soon as complexity cannot be guaranteed, you will inevitably run into all sorts of authority problems. And that's what we see these days. This also nicely explains why on a worldwide level you see these tendencies in societies to go for authoritarian leadership in different countries, or that there is something going on that we might describe as a lack of self-confidence in democracies. And that's the danger lurking behind all the complexity and the complex problems that we have. So if the scientists are right and about climate change, about biodiversity, and I have no good argument to contest what they are saying, I believe, then this might eventually lead to a crisis, not only in terms of the state, but also in terms of its institutions and so on. And some people argue that this is precisely what's going on right now. So you can see this what has been described as a crisis of authority and so on. You can see this as a very normal answer to complex times in which governments can no longer provide immunity to the citizenry. And that's one of the big problems that we have nowadays.
In your opinion, how do you win back the trust of the people?
Yeah, there are very many different kind of ways to do that. And one strategy is, but that's not a strategy in which I believed, and I spoke to that a little bit earlier, is just try to convince people about what is really going on. That is to say, the truth strategy. But you can also try to bring all sorts of misinformation about what is going on, or simply to ignore it, or to there are many different ways in which people, of politicians in general, try to convince people that there is something going on. And it is not to me that to say what is the most effective way, but telling the truth about what is going on has never been a hallmark of politics. That's basically my idea. So if we are, let's say, the bien-pensants in the world are complaining about Donald Trump, then politicians have always lied, and I don't think that you can run a decent society just basing themselves on truths. That's the idea.
Maybe to go back to the theme of security and protection. Let's say in a complex world, everything is interconnected. So our security is also dependent on all kinds of other relations. How can we discern between, let's say, hybrid threats or opportunities in this regard?
Yeah, threats and opportunities. Wherever there is a threat, there is an opportunity, and where there is an opportunity, there's a threat. So I don't like these kind of managerial distinctions. That's and you have in strategic management, and so these course books on strategic management, you have always this so-called SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats. But these are precisely the dichotomies that we should contest in times of complexities. There's not let's say a hard line that distinguishes opportunities from threats, or strengths from weaknesses, and so on. It is what I explained earlier. There's a fluidity between them. So there is we have, for example, this problem of the climate that is increasingly becoming extreme, and so on. This is part and parcel, of course, of climate change and so on. And as soon as there is this threat that some people think is actually taking place, and then there will always be opportunities. So we live in a neoliberal capitalistic society, and look at how entrepreneurs in this capitalistic society have embraced the concept of sustainability, for example. So they see a threat and they immediately translate it into an opportunity, which is also a business opportunity. And this has, of course, caused some havoc among environmentalists and so on, who distrust the concept of sustainability these days, precisely because it has been embraced so easily by the enterprising world. So this idea about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, this belongs to an old logic. I think threats and opportunities they cannot be distinguished on a real, or if you prefer, ontological level. So the logic that is in these let's basically say in the strategic management policy areas and so on, is always at odds with the logic that ecologists accept and know. Their world is full with unexpected things, surprises. One of the words that I coined myself, occasionally philosophers do that, is and we should not become nostalgic for what was. remind you of the European community that produced a document just a couple of months ago that the new ecological standard for all these kind of initiatives on a European level should be, we should get back at the level of biodiversity from the 50s and 60s in the previous age. That's not how it works. You should not get back. That's basically just stupid nostalgia. And for times that used to be, the past has always been better in this kind of logic. No, we should embrace postalgia. So looking forward to what might come, even though you do not know exactly what might come.
Just considering how hard it is to change logics within organizations, maybe especially within the government. Earlier you spoke about organizing your own skepticism in a sense, as opposed to maybe more dogmatic views. Is that a way in which these logics could be changed?
As I already explained, complexity asks for a little bit of skepticism, and so we need to desperately need to develop skills of skepticism, because nobody has, let's say, a privileged access to truth anymore, which means that we have always the possibility to contest what others are saying. And this belies all that I know about institutions, dogmatics, and so on. So in complexity, no one has the final word. The price that you pay for this is, of course, that there is a sheer unstoppable inundation of misinformation, disinformation, and so on. But the problem here is that nobody can claim to have the right information anymore. That is what complexity is also all about. This price that you pay for that. And but what you win is precisely, and I strongly believe that skepticism is about this, that there is always the possibility of counter-speech. And counter-speech, I define skepticism as, of course, it's sometimes based on doubt, skills of doubt, that's what it might be all about. But when you are in doubt about what somebody is saying, you have the possibilities of contesting what they are saying. And that is to say, there's the possibility of counter-speech. That is to say, it also generates a whole lot of creativity in what is going on. So dogmatics I oppose dogmatics to skepticism. Very careful, it is not always that I distrust dogmatics. Dogmatics can be very useful, and so on. But dogmatics becomes a problem as soon as no one is willing to cast a doubt on what is going on, and then things become completely, and then you are marooned in fixed ideas and so on, and that's basically what you don't want. New dogmatics that is very popular these days is a new dogmatics that's very popular these days is, of course, and this is one of my PhD students is studying that, is the dogmatics of sustainability. We act in the name of sustainability. We do things in the name of sustainability. And if you don't act in the name of sustainability, then there's something wrong with you. Difficult.
What other blind spots do you see for policymakers in approaching issues which are characterized by complexity?
Blind spots. Yeah, well, they have basically a Cartesian logic. That's one of the things that I mentioned. And they think in linearity rather than in fluidity. They think in all or nothing, clear-cut dichotomies, rather than if I may use Gilles Deleuze, one of my favorite philosophers and so. They have to learn to think about differences in a much more differentiated way. In fact, we reduce everything to very simple conflicts, but there are many more conflicts, rather than left versus right and so on. That's not so interesting, because you see that left is sometimes very rightish in some of its opinions, whereas right, let's say in this country from socio-economic perspective, is very leftish. So we need to think about these distinctions in a much more difficult way. That is we need to complexify these differences and distinctions, and that is the task that lies ahead and that awaits us. The fact that nobody has privileged access to the truth is rather a challenge to traditional ways of governance. Should you run a society on the basis of facts and truth, or should you run it rather on the basis of myths and good stories, which is not exactly the same as the truth? And of course, in political philosophy, people differ widely about these kind of issues. But my personal opinion is that you don't run a society on the basis of truth alone. And this is one of the things that we learn in complex times. So in whatever you think of Donald Trump, he is a highly efficient politician. And politics means that you bring people together. I remind you of the old word of polis, which is community. That is to say, you bring people together. And he is clearly capable of uniting people. Of course, at the expense of excluding other peoples, which is, but this is part and parcel of politics. As Carl Schmitt always used to say, one of the most important tasks of politics is you have to sort out who are your friends and who are your enemies. And in this sense, Trump is a Schmittian politician. The way that democracy deals with complexity is that some people still hope that democracy is a better way to deal with it rather than autocracy. And why is that? Because democracy is basically a system that is completely running on speech and counter-speech. So the essence of democracy is agonistic, philosophical term, which means struggle. We have conflicts. Democracy is the organization or the institutionalization of conflict, which you can already see when we are talking about the trias politica, and there is no one single source of power that becomes dominant with respect to other sources of power. And that's what democracy is all about. And some people, let's end then in fact with an optimistic note, think that democracy is in a much better shape to deal with complexity than, let's say, more totalitarian systems. Basically because it allows different stories to come on the scene.
Okay, thank you, René.
Yeah, you're welcome.